gentlemen here will be participating in the discussion. I want to thank Glenn Goldsmith for providing us with the schedule of the dredging request, because I do feel that that kind of gave us a lot of helpful information relates to the request and the completion over the past 5 years. It appears that not as much has been done in 2017, and there's a big long list for 2018. So it looks like there might be issues brewing, and maybe timing is everything, and our timing is good. We also know that Legislator Krupski is very concerned about this issue. So I'd like to start by asking you and the rest of the panelists, how widespread is the lack of dredging, and which we know right now, and what are the issues as it relates to getting it done?
Well, I'm sorry, if I could just make an announcement first before we get into the dredging, so I don't want people to leave and not know. The county has this it's a separate topic. The county has an underwater lease program that was set up. It was state authorized. It was set up 10 years ago. And all the towns were involved in the review and the rule making and everything on this. And the county's been leasing underwater land at Peconic and Gardeners Bay for almost 10 years. So the program has some history and some success, but built into it was this 10-year review. And we have hired a firm who the same consulting company that put the original program together. They were the only respondent to the RFP to conduct the 10-year review. The first meeting, so there's a lot of stakeholders there. There's 103,000 acres between Peconic and Gardeners Bay, but there's a lot of stakeholders. There's a lot of current users of that area already. Recreational boaters, commercial boaters. There's wild harvest for shellfish. There's yacht clubs. There's a lot of people who already use that space. And so we're trying to include everybody in this review to make sure that it's done correctly. Unfortunately, the first meeting for this review, it's in Riverhead and Griffin Avenue. It's on the November 14th at 4 o'clock. Unfortunately, it's conflicts with a helicopter meeting at 7 o'clock in Riverhead Middle School at Harrison Avenue. So there's a lot of people who are going to be interested in both of those topics. They're both very important local topics. So I just wanted to put it out. I will send you that information on the underwater leasing program, and you can send it to your members if you could. That'd be great. Thank you.
All right. So let's start with the dredging.
All right. Here I am just thinking I was up here for my good looks.
But he's wearing a tie. Isn't that admirable?
So as far as the dredging goes, as you can see from the list of creeks that were requested this year, last year the county wasn't able to get as many done as they would like, or as we as the town would have liked. A number of different reasons. They got new equipment that arrived late, breakdowns, staffing issues. What's an interesting thing is the crew that runs the dredge, if there's a snowstorm or something like that, they get called off to plow snow instead of dredging. So it's a short window to begin with, and with breakdowns, weather, other incidents, it pulls them away from doing the job. So out of the list that we as the town supplied for last year, only one was completed, and that was Little Creek. Corey Creek got partially done, and then actually the dredge got iced in Corey Creek. So they were in the process of doing it when we got that real cold snap. They got iced in, and then the dredge was stuck there when the window closed. So that's why there's such a long list for 2018. So for the most part, the county has been able to keep up approximately 6, 7, 8 creeks a year. I believe 2017 was more an exception. What happened this year was we were able to get an emergency spring window opened up as well. And during that time period, they were able to do Wickham Creek and Halls Creek. And then what also happened this year was they were able to open the dredge window a little earlier, a couple weeks earlier. So instead of starting on October 1st, they were able to start September 15th. So in that earlier period, we already were able to get Gull Pond in Greenport done. So there's a lot of creeks in Southold with a limited resources from the county. There's one dredge that does all the east end towns. So the creeks definitely need to get done. We need more equipment in order to do that, but they are doing the best that they can. And unfortunately, that window that they have to dredge through no fault of their own keeps getting smaller and smaller due to federal regulations. So it's an ongoing battle. For instance, a new regulation that just popped up that came out of nowhere was monitoring for this red knot bird. So usually the fall dredge window, which started from October 1st through, say, January 15th, you didn't have any restrictions so much in the fall. There's the winter flounder and everything, which is why you can't dredge after January. And then there's the piping floater that you have to worry about in the spring window. So now the federal, through this red knot bird on top of everything. So now somebody with the town has to monitor for this specific bird 4 days prior to any dredging project and during every dredging project. And if there is that bird present, you are not allowed to dredge. So there was no communication with the town, with the county, with anybody. They just threw this down on everybody, and it came as a surprise. So that's just one example of one of the challenges that we face.
You've given us all the reasons why we haven't been dredging, and why it got stuck, and why there's reasons. But what have we accomplished with dredging? What do you plan to accomplish? And what's the schedule of what you plan to dredge?
Sure.
Can you tell us that?
Sure. So as you can see, this year there's a big list. From the town's perspective, what we do is we supply this list of dredge priorities to the county. What is the priority? The priority is hazards to navigation, is the ultimate priority. Any public safety hazards to navigation, like Scott referred to before with the Army Corps of Engineers, for channels and inlets and creeks, that's what they're concerned with, hazards to navigation. So if they're shoaling.
What is your plan for dredging? What's the areas?
Oh,
The creeks?
so this
You have
year,
a list. that
Yep.
you can tell us.
yep,
We have a list.
Wickham
They
Creek,
have a list.
Wickham Creek, Richmond Creek. So there's, for this year, for 2018, 2019, it was Wickham Creek, which was already done, Richmond Creek, Cedar Creek, Brushes Creek, Gull Pond, which was already done, Bud's Pond, Halls Creek, which was already done, Depot Creek, James Creek, West Creek, Mud Creek, and Little Creek. So there's a big list this year, and like I said, it's bigger than previous years just because we didn't get anything accomplished last year. So those are the lists for this year, and out of that list, 3 of them have already been completed.
So I think let me give the overview from the county first, and then we could take a question. So basically, one of the things that Glenn didn't mention was Mother Nature, because that's one of our biggest partners there that determine what needs to be done and how things can get done. I was involved as a trustee. Dave Bergen was here. He was involved as a trustee working on these dredge projects for years. The town's role is fairly limited. The town makes the recommendations because they're the local authority on what the county can do. The county has the dredging in its charter, so the county has the dredge and the dredge crew. But it's not that simple. 10 years ago, there was a big meeting in Riverhead with DEC is another regulatory partner, Army Corps of Engineers is another regulatory partner. A federal Fish and Wildlife weighed in, and they said all these areas could be winter flounder spawning areas. So now we're going to, instead of the county being able to dredge all the way through March, now you can only dredge until January. So now, if the county dredge stops in early January, and we have nor'easters all throughout the winter, that's the condition for the rest of the spring and summer season. So there was no recourse there for getting in and doing any kind of dredging. There is a very small emergency window that can be used, and luckily we were able to use that window with the county dredge and dredge 5 creeks this early summer, and 1 was on the South Fork and 3 were on the North Fork. Myamog Canal in Riverhead was almost completely closed, and that was fortunately done. Wickham Creek in Cutchogue was almost completely closed, and that was done. So, but that's a really difficult regulatory process, and the county dredge actually had to zigzag around because of the closures imposed by Federal Fish and Wildlife and DEC on the timing of those windows. So they couldn't just physically start in one place and work down the line. They had to go zigzag, or complete one, go across the bay, come back again, and kind of jump around. But at least some of those projects were done. So you've got, once the town submits their list to the county, they do their dredge survey to see what they feel that, what needs to be done in their opinion and what they physically can do. There is one dredge crew, and they start to work whenever, the weather will allow them to work. So the weather is a big limiting factor. The time is a big limiting factor. Glenn mentioned the red knot as a new species that everyone's concerned about now that could, again, limit the dredge crew's ability to operate, because you can't just mobilize, you can't just go in there and just start to, and just dredge. It takes a long time to mobilize the equipment and then start to dredge. So and another complicating factor is getting easements from people. The county has about 80 permits that are open for dredging, and they have about 80, active permits. The state DEC has actually been, in my opinion, a pretty good partner as far as working with people with spoil placement and dredge parameters, because most of the dredge projects that are done are maintenance dredging. So there's no new dredging. If you want to expand a permit or get into new areas, it takes on a whole high hurdle of regulatory review between, what's in the spoil, is it contaminated with anything? The particle size has to be compatible to beach placement. So it takes on a whole other level of regulatory review. And sometimes, of course, the county needs easements in order to place the spoil somewhere. So these things could get held up literally for years on these different issues.
Is there any other equipment that could be used? I know that these obstacles, whether they're environmental, whether they're mechanical, breakdown, or is there any other equipment, like vacuum equipment, that could be put in place where you could suck out sand or whatever, that we should be thinking about? This equipment is the same equipment we've had for years and breaking down.
Well, the county just got a brand new dredge last year. So of course, with pretty much anything new, there was a couple bugs to get worked out. But whatever you do, there's always mechanical breakdowns. And that's more of a county question, whether they have the resources to purchase another one, which is a very expensive proposition, not only for the purchase of the equipment, but the crews to operate that equipment. So I think it's a resource and allocation issue.
Has anybody looked at it?
Sure, and I know the town years ago, 10 years ago, when the window really closed on dredging, I know the town looked at purchasing a dredge also. But the resource, like Glenn said, the resources are tight, and people aren't. No one wants. You could have two dredges, and you would do a lot more dredging. But right now, they're getting most of the creeks done and keeping it safe for navigation. And until something changes a lot more drastically, that's probably going to be the same for 2019.
I have a question. We got from down in Camp Mineola, we got a letter from the Corps of Engineers specifying that they're going to do James Creek, and they're putting in like 2 million cubic yards of spoil. Now that's going to be placed on the east side and the west side of James Creek. Now last year I said, why doesn't the county contract other dredgers and get it done? Because we're paying taxes and the erosion is getting worse with the nor'easters that are coming in.
So the county contracts a lot of the west end dredging, but it's very difficult to get dredges because of mobilizing that equipment. It's as expensive to get the equipment there and set it up as it is to do the work. And because of the different dredge windows, it's really difficult to get I'm surprised the Army Corps is going to dredge James Creek. That's the first I've heard of that. But
I've got a 10-page document, and you have a copy of it too.
Yeah, James Creek is definitely on the list this year, and having commercial marinas and a lot of houses and everything down the creek with docks. It's an important one. There gets a lot of shoaling there on the east side, easterly approach to that. and it's just Mother Nature. And, you know, as quick as you dredge it and get rid of it, the next year it's right back. So it's one of those things where in an ideal world it would get dredged every year, but due to a lack of resources and staff and everything, it's pretty much on an every other year schedule. And this year is the year to get it done.
I have an aerial photograph of 1964 when they dredged the creek. There was a big sandbar out there, and when they did that, it destroyed whatever, you know, was going into James Creek before. And it keeps getting worse every year.
Okay, Dave?
Just a clarification, that was an application for an Army Corps permit, and the public comment period just closed on that. That was, yeah, that's not, the Army Corps is going to do the dredging. In order for the county to do the dredging, they have to have that Army Corps permit. So okay, I heard a little, it sounded like people thought maybe the Army Corps was going to dredge it. No.
No, and just for clarification on that, for every permit that the county does, they submit to the DEC as well as the Army Corps, and then you get a 10-year maintenance permit once that permit is approved. So it's got to go through a bunch of regulatory agencies before we get approval.
Well, I guess it's been approved because they were supposed to do it last year.
And what the county has been doing is with these 10-year windows, 10-year maintenance dredging windows, because of such a backlog at the Army Corps and especially the DEC to get a renewal on those permits, they start the process a couple years in advance, knowing it's going to take that long to get a new permit in place.
Well, I think we're just sitting on our butts and they're not really thinking out of the box and to see other ways to get it done. Tax money goes and then it disappears.
Go ahead, Pat.
There is an option for how to get it done, which is, and I'm glad the county is funding and doing one, but it seems that we have limited access and resources with the county's program, again, because they're sharing the manpower is snow removal and dredging, so they could be taken off the project. But there is a process where,
Well, wait, just let me clarify that, because during a blizzard, when they're out there plowing snow, they wouldn't be able to physically be on the dredging. So you really don't have that option to be doing both at the same time, because again, Mother Nature is going to dictate when you can work on the water. I know a few years ago, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Pat, but a couple of years ago when I started with the county, there was a push to charge the towns overtime for the dredge crews when they worked in the towns, and that was something that I was able to stop when I started with the county. I said that's very unfair. It's in the county's charter. The county should be able to, because of weather conditions and because of the permit restrictions, they should be able to provide overtime for the crews so they can get this work done, especially if you're working under the parameters of darkness and you're working under wind and tides and everything. They have to keep working to finish a job and then mobilize all that equipment and move it to the next site. They have to work when they can work.
well, the thought I had was getting the East End towns that do need dredging, having what's called an intermunicipal agreement that can acquire some equipment and provide for an East End dredge that can supplement the county's program. So it's not all the town of Southold that is paying for this equipment that's obviously very expensive, but maybe Southampton and the Riverhead, Southampton and Southold that need the dredging can come together and each contribute a third to that expense and provide for an additional dredging equipment to, again, not take the county off the hook, because we all pay county taxes and it's their, as you said, the charter is part of their responsibilities, but to give a little more flexibility and given that short window, an alternative or a supplement to what is already being done. So I would ask that, that be considered.
All right.
Yeah, let me just point out, I had created a dredging committee a few years ago. The 1 year that there was a real backlog in dredging was a regulatory glitch, not a time frame glitch. Then the ability to dredge, the windows are very tight. Those windows are still going to be tight whether there's a joint purchase of a dredge or not. Also, what the dredging committee, and these are people that lived on the water and had a real stake in the game, What they concluded was that it was a regulatory problem, not an equipment problem. Also, the idea of buying a dredge with other towns, every town has a priority, given the tight windows, who's going to establish the priorities? An intermunicipal agreement by buying one dredge is a good way to, for the towns to establish militias and start fighting over use of that dredge. It just wasn't practical because it wasn't going to change the regulatory landscape, and it wasn't going to open the windows any more than the narrow, tight windows any more than they currently are.
I think, Pat, you took us down the right road, and that is talking about solutions, because when you talk about the problems, you can get very depressed. There's an awful lot of regulatory organizations that are in the picture. But before we do that, I just want everyone here to understand who does set the priorities for Southold Town. How does a creek get on this list? And Glenn, would you be able to handle that?
Sure. So we, as the trustees for the town, set the dredge priority list for the coming year, and it's based on need, based on feedback that we get from the public, based on feedback that we get from the bay constables, people that are in and out of those creeks every day. When they see a hazard to navigation or a public safety issue or whatever the case may be, they communicate with us. I'm just kind of the liaison for the board. We do it as a group. We take that feedback, we compile this list, and then send it to the town, and then we send it to the county. And from there, as Al mentioned, the county will go out and look at those creeks and do a survey on the ones that we put on our list. Sometimes they say yes, sometimes they say no. For instance, Gold Pond, if you look at the list that was handed out, was on the list for a couple of years because we felt there was a need to do it. When the county went out and did their survey, they discovered that there wasn't enough material, in their opinion, to warrant doing the dredging. So we set it every year based on need. Mother Nature wants some creeks closed more so than others. So some of them get done every year. Some of them, like James Creek, every other year. So it's a need-based application.
Yes.
I just wondering, I've got property in Jockey Creek, and the last two big storms, it was about 18 foot of frontage. The cement monuments are out in the creek. I went to the federal government when they were out here once by Salvo and twice in Flanders. Oh, they couldn't help me because I didn't live in the house. My grandson lives in the house. And that's the way it ended. I had no help from the federal government.
Jockey Creek is an interesting dilemma. I grew up right across in Founder's Landing, and the whole time growing up, right by Jockey Creek, there used to be that island with the groins, and it was beautiful, deep sand. Once that went away, it opened up the floodgates to flooding, and all that sand that used to be on that island is now filling in the creeks and filling in the channels, and Jockey Creek is taking the brunt of it because there's as you know, living there, very long fetch, from Paradise Point all the way to Jockey Creek. So storm blowing out of the right direction, it takes a beating in that area.
Well, I'm up close to the marina there, and I haven't seen it. It says in the papers here that it was dredged. I don't remember Jockey Creek.
Jockey Creek, it's the Jockey Creek spur that goes from the end of Pine Neck, the ramp, out to Town Creek. So it doesn't go down the spur down towards the bridge or anything. No. And one of the interesting dynamics with the dredging as far as the county is concerned is it has to just be sand. If they hit silt or mud or muck or anything, they have to stop because it's a whole different dynamic as far as where you can put that dredge spoil, whether it's clean sand or whether it's silt or mud. So,
And that brings into play that's a DEC requirement there, that material has to be tested if it's something other than sand. And what Glenn said about that island that used to be out there, like a barrier island, the DEC years ago wouldn't allow the county dredge to put any more material on it because they considered it intertidal, and so they wouldn't allow material to be placed on it. And the result was that first all the sand washed away, and then all those jetties that were there became debris, and they were all out there still somewhere. So that became a problem, and we objected to the DEC's stance on that, but there was that was the end of it. It's gone.
Question over there.
The first I've seen one of these lists coming to these meetings for a while, and I thank the people, whoever put this list together. My question is, is there a mechanism for the average homeowner to contact someone to find out about these lists and the status of these priorities as listed, how they're resolved, when?
Sure. So we have to, as the town, supply this list to the county. I believe it's in June of every year. So if you have any concerns or issues with your creek, by all means, contact the trustee's office, and we'll funnel it. And as I said, we submit that list to the county, I believe June. The dredge window normally opens October 1st. So between that June timeframe and when the dredging actually occurs, that's when the county goes out and does the surveys of those creeks that we put on our list. And then it's a little difficult, as Al was mentioning, as far as when each creek will get done in that time period. Weather is by far and away the biggest obstacle. One of the issues that I see from Southold Town's perspective is with this one dredge, seems to always start on the south side and then work its way around. So the dredge window closes in January, and that dredge usually is not pulling into Southold Town until December-ish. So we're trying to rush and get those creeks done as quickly as possible, but weather and time is a very limiting factor.
So if I came to the trustees and asked these questions, could I get answers in the office about my particular creek and where it is in the timetable?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. The timetable as far as when it's going to get done, that's more of a county thing than the town. Like I said, we submit the list, but what order they get done is the counting and the dredge and the conditions and the weather and all that kind of stuff.
You know, in the spirit of what can we do, instead of just speaking to the press about it, you mentioned that the dredge always starts on the south fork. Why don't we alternate which fork it starts on?
That's a very good suggestion. So what used to happen is because of the prevailing wind in the winter, they would always leave the North Fork to the end because the prevailing northwest winds in the winter made it easy to work on the North Fork because you're sheltered versus trying to work on the bay on the South Fork where you get the fetch and the wind is really, they're just fighting the weather all the time. So that's why the dredge always started on the South Fork to take advantage of the weather patterns there. So I am going to have to appeal after what happened last year when the dredge got frozen in and they just couldn't complete everything on the North Fork, and then it became a big problem trying to get those 5 creeks done outside of the normal dredging windows, that they're going to have to reprioritize the way the dredge works. Again, that becomes a timing issue because if you start moving the dredge back and forth across the bay, those are days lost when they're not actually pumping sand.
And you know, that's when you mentioned prevailing winds, well, that's sort of what shows us up. We don't know anything about prevailing winds. Maybe that's really not such a big concern.
It is a big concern though, because if you get a prevailing northwest wind in the winter, the creeks here are sheltered from the North Fork, and so that's why they always operated that way.
Is there a source of information, maps that would show the extent to which the dredging is going to be done using the creeks?
Sure, you could either call my office, we could get that to you, or you could call the trustee office and they could get that to you. The DEC, issues very specific permits for the extent of the dredging, the length, the depth, the slope of the sides, everything's very clearly spelled out in that permit.
Just to answer your question, sir, we asked Glenn in the trustee's office to put this list together, and the credit goes to them because they had to do some digging for some of the older information, but we'll get that list every year and put it on our website for sure. Okay, shall we move on to solutions? One of the things that someone mentioned is the flounder and the fact that is it Fish and Wildlife set some restrictions In talking with Cornell, Chris Pickerel, one of the things that he mentioned is possibly doing a study.
I know when we met years ago with Federal Fish and Wildlife, they would not accept any study, so they were willing to shut down the dredge season early because there was a possibility of winter flounder spawning there. They were unwilling to do a study to prove that winter flounder spawn anywhere. Because the people said, okay, if it's spawning ground and you're hurting the population, everybody understands that. But they were unwilling to prove that. And they were also unwilling to accept a private study because even the homeowner property owners association said, look, we'll hire a certified biologist. We'll give you the study saying, and if the study says, yes, the winter flounder is spawning there during that time period, well, they understand. And they were unwilling to accept a private study. So we are working through the normal channels with Federal Fish and Wildlife and with the DEC to see if they can in fact acknowledge that in all likelihood, because there's a lot of biologists who have said the winter flounder are not spawning in these areas and aren't going to use these areas for spawning. They need colder water offshore. So we're trying to work through that process. But any input and any comments we get is certainly helpful to submit to them to say, look, people are concerned about this. They're not happy with your decision because they don't feel that it's based in reality. And so you should not just say, well, this is our decision. We made it years ago and we're sticking with it. So any comments that we get are certainly helpful.
And I think one of the other issues with that is a lot of this information is based on old data that's not current. And whether it's the DEC or Federal Fish and Wildlife, in the absence of new data, they default to conservation. Just say no. You can't prove that there's winter flounder, so we'll say there are, so you can't dredge. So with Cornell Cooperative Extension, hopefully being able to monitor for this winter flounder, potentially proving that they don't exist, because I've been living in this town my whole life. I can't remember the last time I've seen somebody catch a winter flounder, but maybe that's just me. Exactly. But the data that they're basing it on is probably 30 years old. So that's the thing. We need this new data. They don't have the resources, or they're not willing to do it. So can we use Cornell Cooperative or someone else to get that data to prove or disprove that this exists? And then based on that new data, we can formulate a plan going forward and potentially open up a longer window.
Who is the funding to Cornell? Does the county provide funding to Cornell for that type of study?
The county provides funding to Cornell for their general marine program, but and they have other funding sources also. But the county is a big funding source for them.
I would think that there would be a need to, for a grant or something for Cornell to be able to do it. I don't think they'd have extra money. At least that's not the impression that I got. So that's something maybe we all need to think about. How do we help? And that's the next question. We understand that all the gentlemen here are concerned about the dredging and the condition of the creeks. But Al, you are working on something yourself. And we'd like to ask you to tell us a little bit about your plan and tell us how we can help you.
Well, it's just working really within the confines of the regulatory process we were going to try to have another big dredging summit, and that after talking to people in the DEC and talking with the with the county DPW, we realized that was not going to be helpful because we really need to work internally with Federal Fish and Wildlife and DEC to try to figure out how to open up the dredge window a little bit more. Because that's all we need to do is open up the dredge window to more historic levels so the dredge crew would have time to go out and finish these jobs. So, but again, I'll say anyone who has a comment about the dredging should really submit it to my office, submit it to the town trustee office, because that's really helpful to keep pressure on these regulatory agencies to be responsive.
I found this study, I'm not sure if you're aware about a dredging from 1985, and it was done by Suffolk County. Is it something maybe that should be repeated or updated?
I'm not sure. I'll have to take a look at it and see if it needs to be updating. Most of the dredging, it's pretty, most of the dredging that's done is maintenance dredging on these creek interfaces. So it's really, there's very little new dredging that's being done. The county spends money on dredging only when there's because it's public money, only when there's a public benefit. So if there's waterfront access, if there's, like a boat ramp or a marina, those are the areas where the county, because it's public money, will spend the public money to keep those areas open for boating and navigation. There's an environmental component in there that was put in there a few years ago, but that has never been used because it was never, no one's ever been able to prove that the county dredging there would help, you'd be able to quantify the improvement to the environment.
So just to firm up on the suggestions to your office, should the town submit something to you asking for Cornell to do a study? Would that be helpful?
Any kind of request would be helpful. And it's a long process working with these state and regulatory agencies, but any kind of request would be helpful.
Any more questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, could we do that as a group, to have Southold Voice write you a letter? And then the other thing is, it seems that you all three are very on the ball about this type of issue. Is there some way that we can maybe get a sort of timeline or a working diagram, some kind of thing that would be easy to understand about what are the choke points that you guys are finding out, and how we as the public can put pressure on the appropriate representatives that would be able to influence the DEC, the Fish and Wildlife, and things like that, because we do need these studies done. And I think, if we look at it again as a county-wide or statewide or whatever the case is, maybe we can get some action on that and some letters on that, because again, you guys are, on our behalf, are being stymied by the lack of studies, the lack of current action plans by these agencies.
Yeah, let me just point out one thing with regard to studies, and I don't think the county or the town would hesitate in funding a study. The issue is getting people to listen or to accept the study. To give you an example, we have a testing program. We go out and test the water bodies all the time. We go out and prove time and time again that some of these closed out water bodies are not impaired. We have a advisory committee that actually go out and not just test the water, but we do shellfish testing, with what they call flesh testing. And we prove time and time again that the water body should be open, and the DEC shrugs its shoulders and says, well, you know what, we can't open these water bodies until we do the testing. And we say, well, when are you going to get out and do it? And they say, well, we don't have the staff. And under the law, any of the testing has to go through a DEC lab, even though there's some wonderful private labs out there. So we've proven time and time again with our own testing and with other studies that they're incorrect. But you cannot get some of these regulatory agencies at the state or the federal level to accept them. And that's one of the biggest stumbling blocks. It's not just funding the study, it's getting the study done and having someone look at it at one of those levels, one of those agency levels, and say, okay, you've proven your point, we'll move forward and allow you to do this or do that.
Given the fact that it's the regulatory staff level that is reluctant to listen to these studies, we elect officials that override. So you have the governor's office, you have state legislators, you have all of the elected officials that have a say and have influence. So should we be more vocal with our elected officials to encourage them to communicate to their staff people to be more user-friendly, more accepting of the community and the comments and those that are actually in place, and studies, as you said, that open up the regulatory minds to hear something other than what they learned when they were in college.
That's exactly what you need to do. And I mentioned that Oyster Pond's water quality testing issue, And I have to tell you that Senator Laval's office was very good and very helpful. I had Assemblyman Engelbright out there to take a look at it. I took him on a tour. And I have to say that I did get the call in the office last week that the DEC is willing to work with the town of Southold on this problem. So yes, that kind of pressure can be extremely helpful. To have the DEC admit that they're going to work with the town is very positive. I don't know how it's going to turn out, but at least they're going to come out here and they're going to talk to the town, acknowledge that, you know, they need to do better.
To piggyback on that, at the Army Corps level, when you look at the permit applications for the Army Corps, it refers to the Magnuson-Stevens Act at the federal level. That act at the federal level is greatly impacting the dredge windows as well as commercial fishing limits, etc. in eastern Long Island. And what everybody's heard is the commercial fishermen have really provided a lot of input at the federal level because the Magnuson-Stevens Act is in the process of renewal, 10-year renewal, where it's got to be voted on at the federal level. So getting back to what Al and Pat just said, it's also lobbying at the federal level for these dredge windows to be addressed in the Magnuson-Stevens Act that will help, could help potentially those windows in the Army Corps permits. It's the dominoes all falling, and the commercial fishermen have done a tremendous job of being very vocal about this in eastern Long Island, so that those, hopefully those catch limits will be changed and allow for our commercial fishermen in New York to be on par with other states. Well, that's one level, but it's the same thing to be done with dredging.
Yes, sir.
I know that the town has a dredging advisory committee. Are they a potential resource for citizens for discussion, for potential solutions to this problem?
They were very active and they did study the issue literally to death. They looked at all the issues. They met with trustees, they met with regulatory agencies, and ultimately it came down to a regulatory problem, not an equipment problem, like I said. And frankly, I think at this point, the Dredging Committee's exhausted its mission statement. They've done all they can.
Any other questions? All right, before we end the session, I think, Al, you referred to a meeting on November 14th. The FAA is having a public hearing on the helicopter activity, the noise, and the volume of helicopters. And we urge you all, if you have any concern or interest, to participate in this. And I think we could thank Lee Zeldin's office for really raising this to a national level. And we should support that because some people's lives have been dramatically impacted in a very negative way by the volume and the level of noise from these helicopters. So please try to attend, plan to attend. It's November 14th. It's at the Riverhead Middle School, 600 Harrison Avenue. It's a public hearing. They're asking for, hearing from people, and the volume and quantity of comments is critical to getting done what we'd like to have done. It's from 7 to 9 p.m. I know it's in the evening, but it's an important meeting, and having the FAA come out is very important. So I'd urge you all to be there. I'd like to thank you, Al Krupski, Scott Russell, and Glenn Goldsmith for joining us this morning. I'd like to thank you all for coming out on a rainy morning and joining us and participating in the conversation, and invite you again to join us again at our next session. I believe the next session is in March. So we wish you all a wonderful fall and winter, and see you again next year. Thank you.